Michelle started as a journalist in the late 90s, wrote a popular book titled Financial Fine Print in 2003, and for the last 18 years has run a popular blog, footnoted.com, devoted to SEC footnotes. And I follow Michelle on Twitter at footnoted, and so should everybody else. And with that, Michelle, can you give a little bit of an introduction into what you do and maybe a bit about the transition of going from being a journalist to running your own blog service?
Yeah, so I run Footnoted. It just celebrated its 18th anniversary. I started it at when I had written a book in 2003 that came out that I sent you a signed copy of, right?
Yes.
Financial Fine Print, which came out in right around this time in 2003. And, because I had a daily journalism background, I spent the first 10 years of my career working for different daily newspapers in New York, in Connecticut, and Florida. I just felt that, when you write a book, it's very hard when you're a journalist to sort of turn it off and turn off that immediacy. Like, I got to write something else. So, like, when you write a book, there's an end date of when you have to stop writing and get it to the publisher, and then it doesn't see the light of day for like another 6 to 9 months,
Yeah.
assuming they're pretty speedy because it goes through the editing and the production process. And I was like, well, but I still have a lot that I want to say. And if you think back to 2003, which, how old were you then?
Like four.
Really young. So if you think back to 2003, there was a thing called Blogger back then, and it was really brand new.
Yeah.
And a young guy I was working with, had said, I said, I just want to continue the conversation of things I was writing about in the book, and but I don't have any technical background. And he was like, oh, there's this great thing called Blogger, and you can just kind of post away. And that's really how I started. I started with Blogger, kind of continuing on some of the ideas of the book. And I kind of made a goal where I was like, every day, I was living on the East Coast then. Now I'm in California. But I'm also a world champion in cross country moves, having moved cross country 3 different times in the last 8 years. So there you go. Need moving tips? You can come to me, SEC tips, all of the above. After, writing the book, basically what I was doing is I made a goal to set every day by 11 a.m. I was going to post one thing a day, which was the start. And a lot of people gave me advice early on, like only write about Apple and Google and like the big companies. And I was like, no, there's so much competition. There's so many people writing about that stuff. I'm like, I want to do what I want to do. So I just started focusing on, roughly, I would say it's roughly the Russell 3000, but I can certainly go above and, I can certainly go below that if I want to.
Yeah.
Um, it really just depends on what catches my eye in a filing.
Absolutely. So Michelle, before this interview, I solicited questions from Twitter. And one
Yeah.
of the common questions that a lot of people were asking is your approach towards reading SEC filings. So like a 10K or an S1 can be hundreds of pages long. Do you read it cover to cover? How do you approach reading these long documents? What are some of the first things you'll do when reading?
Yeah, I don't think anyone really reads it cover to cover. I mean, maybe the proofreaders who are like working at the law firms.
Yeah.
But even then, I find typos in SEC filings all the time.
Yeah.
So, I think, you got to pick and choose what you want to do. And obviously, it depends on what you're looking for. For me, as a journalist, researcher, whatever you want to call it, I'm looking for very specific things. That would be different if I was an investor.
Yeah.
I don't spend a lot of time looking at the financials because I'm more interested in the words that are being used to describe the financials. I figure
Yeah.
other people, I can certainly read financials, I can certainly read, the balance sheet and everything, but I just find that that's not value added for my particular look at it. Other people, if you are investing in the stock, you should definitely be doing that. So, like, with a 10K, for example, I love to look at like, I love to look at like where they talk about their business description because it
Yeah.
talks about always in the 10K, they talk about the number of employees they had and how much office space they have. And so, like, just looking at Lululemon last week when they filed their 10K, you could see that they went from 65,000 square feet of office space to something like over 300,000 square feet of office space. Now, I haven't investigated Lululemon extensively, but I would guarantee that that probably wasn't touted in a lot of places. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of like a little factoid that you get only by reading the SEC filing. So I always like to look at that part of it. I love to look at the risk factors. I mean, I would say I probably pretty much always start with the risk factors. And again, just thinking back to Lululemon's filing last week, and I was tweeting a bit about that at the time, but like, they had some really interesting language in there, and it was like our most serious or our most pressing. I forget what the exact language was, but it was basically like our most serious and pressing risks.
Yeah.
And there aren't a lot of companies that do that. Normally they just say risk factors and
Yeah.
then they kind of list them. And then it's up to you to really figure out if they've moved around like the Jenga pieces, like, the deck chairs, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? Like all of a sudden one year, maybe cybersecurity is up at the top because they had a hacking incident.
Yeah.
And then the next year it's like, risk factor number, 20. So it's always interesting to me to look at that. So like with Lululemon, they kind of ranked the top, their most serious ones, and then they had another bunch of pages. And I think that they had quite a few number, when I actually just counted up the pages of risk factors, there was, a significant increase just if you were just to look at it and say, I forget the exact numbers. I tweeted about it, and I apologize, I don't have it off the top of my head. But it was like something like basically a 50% increase in the number of pages devoted to risk factors. Actually, maybe closer to like 40%. It wasn't exactly 50.
Yeah.
But it was a significant increase. Now, if I was an investor in Lululemon, I would want to read those risk factors word for word, and certainly use like a black line service or whatever to really like figure out why are they doing it. I mean, one of the things I always say about SEC filings, and I've said it from day one, is that there are no accidents in SEC filings. Everything that is in there is there because some attorney or some, accountant or some combination of the attorney and the accountant basically said like, hey, you got to get this in there so that when the plaintiff's bar comes around and says, you didn't disclose this, you can say, nope, on page, whatever, it was disclosed, you didn't read it or, whatever. I mean, you think back to like, one of the most famous cases, which was Enron in their, I think it was their 1999 10K. They talked about, all of these like Chewbacca and whatever, like those crazy named special purpose entities, but they didn't like go into great detail. They just said under related party transactions, they were like, we have these deals and blah, blah, blah. If you've never read that footnote, it's footnote 16. I believe it's in Enron's 1999 10K. And I write about it in my book, all the way back then. It's just such an eye-opening experience. It's really educational, and I would encourage all of your listeners to go back and look at that in light, especially of, obviously hindsight is 2020. But I would challenge you to say, like, based on what they wrote, did you know that this was as much of a screw up as, as it turned out to be, right? Like, I mean, I think it would have been a hard leap to make. You could have said, like, something was going on. There was a lot of problems at this company. Definitely something a little squirrely going on. But was it going to be like the biggest fraud, bankruptcy, debacle in up until then, in 2000? No, probably people wouldn't have figured that out. So I encourage you to go back and look at that as an exercise. It's pretty interesting.
Awesome.
Other parts of the filing that I always look at, risk factors, always, well, it depends on the 10K. If it's an S1, you're going to get the summary compensation table. And so you're going to read about that for the first time. That's less likely or less prevalent in the 10K, unless a company is, some companies will do that. But definitely in the S1, you're going to see the summary compensation table. So like, I wrote a story for Bloomberg the other day about Warby Parker, and they filed their S1 for the first time. And it was really interesting to see how their compensation, you had no idea what the compensation was before that. Mm-hmm. Related party transactions. I mean, that's another interesting thing too. I always like to look at, that's more, again, in the S1, you're going to find that, or in a proxy statement, as opposed to the 10K. So, there's all sorts of things. I think that what you need to do is based on your particular, view of the world, you need to figure out where you're going to start and, what makes sense to look at. But I would never suggest that you need to read an SEC filing, a 10K cover to cover, or an S1 cover to cover, because some of them, I mean, quite frankly, I've come across some that are like 1,200 pages, 1,500 pages. I mean, you'd go blind, you'd go crazy.
Very cool. So you've read a lot of SEC filings.
Yeah.
What are some common red flags that'll stick out to you that, like, when you read it, wait, something might be off here. I want to investigate more. What are some of the common red flags? And also, on the other hand, what are some green flags or like positive signs that might you interested in investing in a company?
I think anytime a company comes up with a new metric, like a
Yeah.
metric that you've never heard of before, or that is significant, that maybe is different this year than it was last quarter or last year, I
Yeah.
would say that that's like a big red flag, right? Because it's like, the numbers will tell you, they can call it anything they want. Like, I mean, like you see like adjusted EBITDA minus, I mean, like companies will come up with all sorts of things. You really want to look at the language
Yeah.
on what they're doing there. Um, and so, I think that those are like, that's like some of the biggest red flags when companies start changing metrics. Like last quarter, we were measuring widgets, and now we're measuring widgets minus, restricted income. I don't know, make up a term, whatever.
Yeah.
The point is that when you're changing it from one quarter to another or one year to another, whatever the term is, you want to make sure. Or even if they change the definition, like last year we were measuring widgets and this included A, B, C, D, and this year we're measuring widgets and it includes like A through K. So, there are different like subtle changes. I mean, again, just really, there are no accidents in SEC filings. Everything is there for a reason. You don't always know the reason at the time that you're reading it. Sometimes I'll read something and I'll be like, this seems odd, but I don't know that it's going to turn to, a big problem. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly in this market, I mean, there's all sorts of things you read and it's like, wow, this company should be in bankruptcy, and, you know, nobody else thinks so.
Yeah.
Based on the filing, I should say.
Yeah.
Other things like red flags. I mean, obviously, companies that are doing, that have significant risk factors, or where the language seems particularly unusual.
Yeah.
A big one would be like, if a company starts talking about a going concern.
Yeah.
I think about Robinhood's filing. Anytime a company has a significant like chunk of their revenue tied to one sort of stream. So
Yeah.
like in Robinhood's filing, like with the PFOF, and you see
Yeah.
that like 80% of their revenue for that particular quarter, their first quarter was
Yeah.
tied to like, that. Without really looking at it, you don't want 80% of your revenue to come really, necessarily from anywhere, and especially something that is, sort of seems to be in the regulatory crosshairs, so to speak.
Yeah.
Um, so those are the sorts of things. I mean, sometimes I think I don't have, people have often asked me, do I have a checklist for a filing? Can I provide them with a checklist? And I don't really have anything formal like that. I kind of
Yeah.
bounce around depending on the company, depending on how I know it, how well I know it. And also whether, I used to joke around about how there were kind of frequent flyers. I mean, there were some companies like Hertz, for
Yeah.
example, they used to just play fast and loose with their filings. They always did like things that were kind of like aggressive. They'd sneak stuff in. You
Yeah.
know, certainly, if a company files late on a Friday afternoon, I talk about the Friday night dump, and I often tweet about it. I think companies that are trying to sneak something in there, it's worth paying more attention to.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of like, it's all over the map. Green flags, I would say, like, I mean, I wrote about Warby Parker the other day. I think that the compensation there seems normal or moderate, whatever. I don't know if you could say $450,000 is moderate, but it's moderate given the
Yeah.
company, the success, and everything like that.
Yeah.
And I called it was like the anti WeWork because, if you look back to We's S1, if you were to compare, let's say, the We company's S1 to Warby Parker's S1, both New
Yeah.
York City based companies, you know, and the two S1s, granted they were different years, but the two S1s couldn't be more different.
Yeah.
One was just like, it's more modest, like modest salary. The directors aren't like, at the, sucking at the teat, so to speak.
Yeah.
There's no crazy related party transactions, like where, Warby Parker decided to trademark the letter W and like they're selling it back to the company for
Yeah.
for $5 million. I mean, there's just all sorts of those things that you look at and you're kind of like, it's I mean, I hate to use the, the expression, but a fish stinks from the head, right? So, if
Yeah.
you see all this stuff and these executives who are enriching themselves, and there's a, look, it's not to say like, I mean, one of the things I tried to be careful about in the story that I just did was like, if you're an entrepreneur and you're building value and you're successful, you should be rewarded. But there's a difference between being rewarded and being like basically treating the company as your own personal piggy bank.
Yeah.
you know like I look at, like, Mark Zuckerberg. I look at Facebook's filing from, the proxy statement from a couple months ago, back in I can't remember if it was March or April,
Yeah.
but like 24, they're spending over $24 million on his security. Now, no one is arguing that he's probably not a target. I mean, he's a target, I'm sure, right? There's probably lots of people who maybe have a target on him.
Yeah.
Not maybe literally, but like, he's certainly a high profile person. He
Yeah.
has a family. He deserves to have the proper security to keep his family safe.
Yeah.
But does he need, I mean, he's a pretty wealthy guy. Like, are you going to tell me he can't hire? I mean, I was trying to do the math. Like, even if he's hiring security guards and he's got like 10 of them at $200,000 a year, and I don't know what the going rate is for a secure. Okay, so that's 2 million. Where's the other, 22 million coming from? I mean, a fancy alarm system, maybe an armored car. I don't know, but like, I just, when I look at something like that, and I'm just like, here's a really wealthy guy. Why is he going to the company? Now, granted, he's not taking a salary, so you can argue that, but it's not, he's also not eating ramen either. No one's arguing, I mean, it just feels like when you see those sorts of things, I think that, then the company is starting to, it's worth paying closer attention to.
Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, just a quick question here. Is there a tax benefit to a company paying for like all the security and fringe benefits for Zuckerberg? So if they compensated him 20 million, he needed to pay 10 million in taxes and then could spend the rest in security, versus the company just pays the 20 million, that's like kind of tax deductible for them because it'll be reflected in lower profit.
Yeah, I honestly don't know, Edwin. I mean, I am not a tax expert on that. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. Do you know that for a fact?
No,
I
no,
mean,
that was my intuition that,
yeah.
it saves, they could compensate him 40 million, he pays 20 million tax and then spends that on security, versus this pay 20 million directly. And then I don't think he'd need to pay a tax on the security the company's providing him. That's my gut.
I would think so. I mean, like, I'm thinking back, like, because like a lot of companies, and it's not as common as it used to be, but like a lot of companies would throw in a gross up.
Yeah.
Like, so they would gross you up for taxes, and that was like a thing that would really, like, it's like, it's gross. A gross
Yeah.
up is gross. If you're successful, do whatever you need to do to minimize your tax bill. That's legal. I have no problem with that. But like, then you're asking shareholders to cover your tax expense because you're well compensated.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me is just like, really now, please. So I think, not to sound like a mom here, I'm like, come on, I don't buy that BS, right? Come on. I think that, with that, if I remember correctly with gross ups, I mean, I think it is taxed at a different rate than compensation, but I think it is still taxable.
Okay.
But perhaps treated differently. Maybe one of your viewers who's a tax person can clarify that for me, because I actually don't know.
Email us and we'll put the answer online. Let's talk about more games companies play with disclosures and trying to prevent investors from seeing the truth. I think one thing you highlighted, it might have been Peloton or Tesla or both, in their filings, instead of just having it always be text, there's like images of text. And when it's an image of text, that's not searchable through Control F. So fewer people will find like some weird text in an image. What's going on with companies using images in SEC filings? Is that a red flag to you? And what are some other games companies are playing to make it harder to find disclosures, or like disclosing something without disclosing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's hard for me to, without talking to the company, and like, I don't want to say like, oh, they are, absolutely up to no good. But when I look at like, I first wrote about something with Tesla's filing. They changed it about, I want to say almost 2 years ago, where they used to just have the text and then they switched to a scan of a text. And not only within the scan of the text, but then they were switching fonts within the text. so that even if you tried to like drag it into like, let's say, another program and highlight it, you couldn't because there were two different fonts or three different fonts. So
Yeah.
it really got very complicated. It's hard for me to believe that a company as sophisticated as Tesla that sends like a rocket to like, can't figure out how to work Adobe Page.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I don't want to say that they're, evil necessarily without actually giving them the benefit of the doubt. I
Yeah.
would say that it's certainly suspicious, that all of a sudden they started doing this. And the same thing, I mean, like, it's just, I think, and I know this is probably a low priority for the SEC because I've talked to them about this. When companies do scans of PDFs, it does make it harder for ordinary people to like look through the filings. The big quant funds, they have ways of getting around it. They're doing like, optical scans and they're, figuring out their own,
Yeah.
methodology to do that. But like, ordinary, let's say ordinary investors or maybe someone at a smaller fund, it's just a pain in the neck. And the only thing that it tells you is like, if you're looking at, let's say you're following 40 different companies, right? You're an analyst or a junior analyst at some company, and you're at some firm, and you have 40 different companies on your coverage or 30 different companies. Are you going to like really take the time to try to like go into a filing that's more complicated to read, or are you going to kind of take the path of least resistance? So I think anytime a company throws up like like sort of barriers, whether they're real, like whether they're being done, how would I phrase this? Whether they're being done vindictively or on purpose, or they're just being done because nobody's catching them, I think that's a problem. And it just basically tells you like we're not really trying to be as open and about our disclosure as we can. Other red flags, I would say, like, other types of things, in terms of disclosure. One of my favorite like things that drives me crazy is when companies include form of agreements.
Hmm.
And these are exhibits at the end of a 10K or a 10Q or even an 8K, where it's just like, a stock option agreement, and it's basically like a blank legal document. It's almost like a legal Zoom that they include as an exhibit, but you can get zero information from it. It doesn't tell you the number of options. It doesn't tell you who they're going for. It doesn't tell you what date they can be exercised. It tells you zero. It's
Yeah.
just like pages. It could be a page. It can be many pages of just legal, like, gobbledygook, and it tells you zero information. So why file that in the first place? Like, why put that out there? I mean, the company, as I understand it, the SEC is requiring you to disclose material contracts. That's what the whole exhibit disclosure is about. But if you're providing like a legal Zoom document that's just a fill in the blank, that's not really disclosure.
Yeah. Huh, interesting. So, Michelle, you know a lot about the SEC and how it works. It sounds like you've talked to the SEC. What do you think of Gary Gensler as the new chairman and some of the pushes he's trying to make in terms of disclosure? And how are we going to see filings change over the next few months and years?
Well, I think, it's very interesting. Like, I think back to the whole brouhaha over like the 13F disclosures.
Yeah.
Now, unlike a lot of people, and I've actually written about this, I don't find 13Fs to be all that useful in their current form.
Yeah.
They're 45 days after the fact. They don't include all of a fund's positions.
Yeah.
45 days is an eternity for some of these hedge funds. I mean, they could be like out of that position. They could be like, just they know people are, going through the filings. And so,
Yeah.
like anything really good, I mean, like, if you look at Warren Buffett, how many times he's sought confidential treatment when he files a 13F, because he knows that if he was to disclose a new position while he's building it, everyone's going to like get into it and it's going to drive the price up. So I think that like, they really need to think about like smart reform of the 13Fs. There's absolutely no reason in this day and age when trades are happening at the, number and the speed that they are, that you have to wait 45 days. There's absolutely no reason why you have to like why it's only including like long positions. It's not including like I mean it's not including a lot of the other positions. That's now I'm drawing a blank. What was the name of that fund that blew up? The London fund. Um,
Not
oh my god.
Archegos?
Yeah, Archegos.
Archegos. Okay.
They never even filed a 13F, and yet they were like a huge fund.
Yeah.
You know, that's a big problem that you had a company that was able, a fund that was able to cause that much damage in the market. And they never even filed it. You know, if you search for a 13F for them, and there's nothing. So
Yeah.
how useful are the 13Fs then? You know, I mean, and they weren't providing any of their positions on that. So I think about that, and I'm like, you know, I think there's definitely some reform that's needed. I think that, you know, companies. I think you can probably speed up the amount of time for. You know, it would be nice if they sped up the amount of time for a 10Q. I always like it. You know, you mentioned the green flag. When a company files their 8K, their earnings 8K, and their 10Q at the same time, that's like a nice thing to do because it allows you to sort of look at what they're reporting in terms of
Yeah.
earnings and what like how the sausage is actually being made, right? Because the
Yeah.
10Q is going to have all of those details. So that's always interesting to me. You know, like when you have a company like, you know, and Yahoo used to be famous for this back when they were an independent company, they put out the earnings report, you know, and the stock would bounce and then like they'd file the Q 40 days later when nobody had even remembered what the hell the earnings were. You know, they
Yeah.
file it like on the last possible day of the deadline or something. You know, companies do that and they have this huge gap. So I always like think about that. You know, it's always great when a company files. I mean, I think they can. It's nice to see companies that file their Q on the same day as their earnings 8K or within a day or two, whatever. But like it would be nice if they sped it up. There's no reason that it needs to take, you know, as long as it does anymore because, you know, there's software now to do this. I mean, a lot of the 8K, a lot of the 10Q is basically from the prior, you know, it's not like they're writing a 10Q over and over again every quarter. I mean, they're tweaking things, but you know, so I'd like to see some of that. You know, as far as Gensler, I mean, I think he has some good ideas. I think that it'll be interesting to see if he can get them through the SEC because every time, like, it seems like he comes out with an idea, then there's like, you know, Roisman and Hester
Pierce.
Hester
Yeah.
Pierce is like, you know, coming out with a counter statement, and it's like I didn't realize the SEC was like the Supreme Court. You know,
Yeah.
like there has to be like a close decision there. To me, it just seems like you know, I mean, I haven't studied the SEC in depth, but I don't remember there being this many like you know, I don't remember there being this many close decisions or like counter opinions or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's just an indication of our, you know, our life and times right now that even something as like, you know, seemingly boring as the SEC has also been politicized.
Yeah.
Like it ought to be like we all, no matter what your political position is, we ought to be able to agree that, you know, free and fair markets are an objective here in the United States. I don't care if you're a Trump Republican, if you're a Mitt Romney Republican, if you're a Bernie Sanders guy, you should be agree on that. And it shouldn't
Mhm.
be politicized.
Very good. What about like ESG disclosures and human capital disclosures and reform around 10b5-1 plans? Any opinion on those issues?
Yeah, I mean, the 10b5-1 things is like another example where there's non-disclosure disclosure. So
Yeah.
it's disclosure in name only. But, you know, a company, you know, they don't have to disclose when an executive enters into a new plan.
Yeah.
They have to disclose when it's sold, and they'll say, like, we sold it pursuant to a 10b, you know, 5 plan. But they don't have to actually disclose the existence of it, and they don't have to disclose any of the details. Like John Doe has 150,000 shares, and when the price hits $30 a share, he's going to sell 50% of them or something like that. I mean, maybe that might be too specific. I certainly don't want to like penalize people or
Yeah.
whatever, but there has to be a way to provide a little bit more information than most people are getting from a 10b5 program.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I don't know if that's a priority or not. I mean, I certainly, you know, it's not like Gary Gensler and I are BFF and we talk all the time.
Yeah.
Um, or any of the time, I should say. You know, just to be clear.
Yeah.
um, you know, I think that, you know, there's other things that, you know, they can focus on. I mean, you know, it seems like, you know, especially at this time of year, as we get close to the end of the fiscal government year, the SEC is grinding out those press releases. I don't know if you're on their distribution list, but I'm getting like, you know, it feels like 3, 4, 5 a day of
Yeah.
different like small bore, you know, seemingly small bore, you know, issues. So it would be nice if they actually, you know, found a way to go after a bigger company. But of course, the bigger companies have better lawyers, right? It's a lot easier to go. I mean, that Netflix case, I don't know if you remember that from a couple weeks
Yeah,
ago,
yeah,
where the guy was like insider trading and I mean, that just seemed like, I mean, stupid. Like the guy was just like he wrote something on a message board about I mean, it was just seemed like really like stupid to write something. Whatever it was he did, I remember
yeah,
it was like, I think this company is going to get sold. Let's buy some. Like, I
yeah,
mean, if you're, I mean, at this point, I think you shouldn't assume, I think some of these people assume that because they're using an encrypted messaging app, whether it's WhatsApp or,
mhm,
Telegraph or, any of the other ones. It's like they think that those messages are private, but I think the SEC has figured out a way to get to some of those. I don't know how, um, but they certainly are.
yeah.
Because a couple of their recent, releases have noticed they've talked about encrypted messages and using them. So I think, there's a lot of, I think basically a lot of the laws that the SEC is kind of, adhering to, following, date back to the market crash in 1929.
Yeah,
1929 was a long time ago. It's almost 100 years ago.
yeah,
I mean, there wasn't the internet back then. There wasn't, I think that, in some ways the SEC really needs to, catch up with some of those changes. Um, and I think there's some very smart, I'm not one of those people like, oh, the SEC is a bunch of idiots, like that. I think I know a number of people there. They are smart, they are
yeah,
dedicated, they are hardworking. I mean, if you intern there, you probably ran across some of them.
yeah.
They want to do what's right, but sometimes politics, I think, gets in the way.
Absolutely. Um, SEC filings can be really complex. You mentioned that you use blackline services sometimes. What are some free and paid tools you like to use to get the most out of SEC filings? Like, do you read it directly on Edgar? Do you do other sites? Any newsletters you subscribe to? What do you do to make your job more effective?
I mean, I used to use when I first started, I used a site called 10K Wizard, but they no longer exist.
Yeah,
I felt like what they did was pretty cool because it was like the first company that allows you to set up alerts for like different word searches.
yeah,
So if you wanted to know anytime the word subpoena appeared in a filing, you would get an alert about that.
yeah,
Or Wells notice or whatever. I mean, at one point I had like something like 300 odd word searches going through SEC filings, and anytime one of those words appeared, I would get an email about it, and either me or my folks who were working for me would look at those. But 10K Wizard no longer exists. There's a number of other services. I mean, like obviously Sentio, AlphaSense.
yeah,
There's a number of services that are out there. That are doing a really good job at it, that are trying to, do a really good job of parsing through the filings and getting things done. What's the other one I'm thinking of? Oh my God. I look at so many different services. Now I'm drawing a
yeah,
blank on it. Anyway, there's a number of different services out there. Some of them are free, some of them are not. There's a guy I follow on Twitter who does audio versions of SEC filings, which I think is kind of interesting.
huh.
It's almost like a podcast of SEC filings, which seems like that would be, I mean, if I was, I listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm walking. I think I would fall asleep if I was listening to an SEC filing. They'd find me on the side of the road, like.
Yeah,
But so there are different. I do use Edgar a lot. I use
yeah,
Edgar because it's freely accessible. I mean, certainly when I write about things, I don't know if you subscribe to like AlphaSense or if you subscribe to Sentio or you subscribe to Bloomberg and you read your SEC filings that way, or I don't even know like whatever service you have. I mean, there's a lot of there's like easily a half dozen paid services out there, and probably about as many free or moderately priced non-professional types of services. So I don't know what you have. So I do use Edgar, and Edgar has significantly improved over the years. I know everyone likes to hate on Edgar, but I think like I've exchanged emails with the guy who's basically responsible for Edgar, and he knows the problems there, and he's a smart guy. And he seems really dedicated, a guy by the name of Jed Hickman, and he seems like he's, really dedicated to, making Edgar as good as it can be. And, you have to think about it. If you ever also do court cases,
Yeah.
think about the difference between Edgar and Pacer. Pacer, you can quickly hit a limit and it starts to get really expensive.
Yeah.
At 10 cents a page. I mean, if I was looking at SEC filings, if they had made a model no, so I mean, seriously, if they had made like a Pacer for Edgar,
Yeah.
like at 10 cents a filing, forget it. I'd be like bankrupt by now. I mean, because a 10K could easily be, 50 pages, and then you 10 cents a page, and then multiply that. I mean, it's just,
Great
it's,
point. Great
yeah.
point.
So, as much as you can hate on Edgar, it's free, it's
Mhm.
accessible, it's been improving.
Do you do anything with FOIAing the SEC, or is that not something you
I
do?
don't. There's that guy in Minnesota,
Yeah, John Gavin.
yeah, John Gavin, who is really like the FOIA of the SEC expert.
Yeah.
And that's his sandbox, and he can have it. And he really built a market there, and good for John.
Yeah. You had a really popular story recently about Robinhood, and they had a former SEC commissioner who's serving as their chief legal officer who got a $4 million signing bonus and a huge options grant. And, I think one common criticism of the SEC is that you have people who go there, they work a little, they leave after a few years, and they go to the companies that they were previously regulating.
Yeah.
Is this a really serious problem in your view? Is it okay? Is there changes that need to be made? How should the public feel about this issue and seeing an SEC commissioner join a public company?
I mean, there was a little bit of a gap between, when because he did go into private practice after that. I
Yeah,
forget when he stopped, when this was Dan Gallagher, and I forget when he stopped working as SEC commissioner
yeah,
and went to a law firm, and then went to and then he was a board member of Robinhood, and then he joined Robinhood. So I don't want to really squeeze off on Dan there, who I don't know. Maybe he's a lovely person. But you have to ask yourself, why would a company like Robinhood be paying him a $4 million signing bonus?
yeah,
And would they be paying him a $4 million signing bonus if it's basically for his connections and who he knows, right? In the old days, you would have said like for his Rolodex, but nobody
yeah,
has a Rolodex anymore. So, I mean, that's basically, and the options. I mean, the options are pretty significant based on, I mean, again, you don't have all the details on what the exercise price is and blah, blah, blah. But it's not, it's not the pocket, it's not pocket change. Let's put it that way. And, I mean, again, someone does a good job, a hard job, should be well compensated. But that to me, and it wasn't just him, it was the fact that they had hired like basically a baseball team, enough people to fill a baseball team with extra people that, three or four extra people left over that like were either from FINRA or from the SEC. Now, both of those organizations, agencies, I guess, have settled, like bigly, to use our former president's words, Robinhood has settled really, probably big settlements with both of those. And then to see a bunch of employees working for them just feels like, I mean, yeah, in theory, I think, there's a year break where the company has to, where the executive, whatever, can't lobby, lobby their former agency. But like, you're going to say that you cut off all communication. You worked with someone for a couple of years. You were their direct, with Dan Gallagher, for example, he hired his chief counsel, and, I mean, and that guy's contacts. And like, it just, you got to say like, if it appears, if you get the appearance of like sort of the ick factor,
yeah.
maybe you should stop to think about it. I don't know.
Very fair. So on the topic of large cash and stock grants, one of my favorite people on Twitter is @nongap, who talks about corporate governance, and he's super good at like saying, oh, there's this options grant, which means like some event might be happening in 2 months. And almost always he's right. And it's just nuts. Like you see a weird options grant and you're able to translate that into like, oh, a merger is about to happen, or like a good drug like results are about to come out. If I as a novice investor, or somebody watching this wants to like understand the dark arts of corporate governance, and like what option grants are suspicious, what like, what these like innocuous things can actually be huge signals for the future.
Mhm.
Do you understand that well? Is there stuff you look for that it's like, this options grant is odd, this is a really bullish sign? How do you think about stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, Mike and I have talked about it quite a lot. He actually lives out here in California, and back before COVID, we used to have lunch pretty regularly when he
Oh,
was
awesome.
you know, when he was still working for Relational.
Yeah.
His actually, it's a true story. His parents live a block away from me, so he'll come up. He visits his parents, and so
Yeah.
sometimes, he lives in a different part. He lives further south of LA, but he'll come up here, and so we would meet for lunch from time to time and chit chat and stuff like that. So I think, he's doing a really good job with that, with the options grants and everything. I think there certainly are dark arts. I mean, I've been tracking this, as I mentioned on Twitter, I've been tracking this for a long time. And I would say that my own personal investing, I do a fair amount of this where I'll find something in an SEC filing and I'll buy the stock. And, thinking that there's a merger agreement that's likely to happen. The challenge that you have with that, and and I never write about what I'm buying, and
Yeah.
I don't keep that public. I'm not one of those like, oh, I bought, X number of shares of this and you should too, because I think a deal's going to happen. I'm not like that type of person. I'm going to keep that to myself.
Yeah.
In part because I'm still testing out my theories, right? So there's that. But I feel like I have a good knowledge and a good understanding of that. The thing that you don't have, and where you can kind of wind up running into problems, is that even if you see, and a lot of times I'll describe this as like, I'm an old married person, so it's been a long time, right? But like you're going out on a date. So right, you take out you're going on Tinder or whatever
Sure.
site you're going on for the first time. You make sure you're wearing a clean shirt. You make sure you look normal looking, like you're not like sitting there going,
Yeah.
like, some picture like that, right? So you can see a company kind of like preparing, like they're doing the dating,
I
right? And they're
see.
cleaning themselves up to look good for the date. Or if you want to say a job interview, they're cleaning themselves up. They're making sure there's nothing there. That would be a huge like, oh, I don't want to date that person. I don't want to
Yeah.
hire that person. Let me make sure that, the arrest, the Facebook picture from my college days where I'm wearing a toga is like,
Yeah.
like burnished, let's delete that one.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes you can see it. The shortcoming there is that there's a lot that it takes to get to like, sort of like the marriage for it to consummate, right?
Yeah.
And so like you can see someone preparing to get married and like maybe hoping that this is Mr. Right or Mrs. Right or whatever your preference is. Because I'm in California and I have to be like PC.
Hmm.
And so you can see someone preparing for the big thing, but you don't. But it could fall apart. Like the CEOs can meet, and there's just no meeting of the minds.
Yeah.
So something falls apart. And so, sometimes you can see a company taking steps in what you might think is an M&A, cleaning themselves up for an M&A transaction, whether it's on the option side, whether it's doing something else. But the deal doesn't happen. And I've had that happen, and sometimes it happens a really, really long time. I think back to like like when I first started like looking at this and I wrote about like Joann's stores.
Hmm.
I can't remember if it was Joann or Mike's. I think it was Joann's when they were
Okay.
public the first time
Yeah.
around. And, from the time that there was a signal in the SEC filing until the deal was announced, it was about 15 months.
Yeah.
And during that time, like normally it doesn't take 15 months to like get everyone together and like
Yeah.
you have that initial meeting and I want $20 a share, but you're only offering 18. So we got to get to, it doesn't usually take that long, but in that case, it took a really long time. And I can think of other situations like that. So you don't know the backstory really until you see the merger proxy, which comes out after the fact. And of course, then you have the backstory, but it's kind of late.
So it sounds like the big signal is cleaning up options grants, like scrubbing the past ones and issuing new ones with a very clean structure. That's like the biggest signal. Is that
Yeah, I
right?
mean, I think that's one of them. I mean, you can see other things like, like it could be an employment contract. It
I
could
see.
be, it
Like a
could
change
be,
in control provision. Sorry to cut you off. Like a change in
yeah.
control provision. That's the sign specifically, or
Not necessarily, but I mean, like, what you have to do, I mean, it's really all about pattern recognition.
okay.
So it's like if you see a company, what was a company I was looking at all the other day? There was a company I was looking at, and I took a flyer on it. I bought 100 shares of it. And it was like they had an employment contract with with their CEO. And
Yeah,
normally they renewed the employment contract like at the end of the year. And all of a sudden they renewed it in August.
I see. Okay.
And so like I'm like, okay, well for like the last, X number of years, they renew this employment contract in December and the
Yeah.
employment agreement expires at like this, let's say, I don't remember all the details, but let's say like, normally the employment agreement expires December 31st. And so either like late December or early January, they enter into a new agreement with him. But now all of a sudden they were entering into a new agreement with him in August, even though the current agreement doesn't expire until the beginning, like either the end of
Yeah.
2021 or 20, so like that type of thing might be something that would catch my eye. Whether that will prove, I mean, I'll let you know in a couple months, whether that proves to be, a real signal or not, we'll see. You know, I'll tweet about it if it is.
Very cool. Michelle, this has been like an awesome 50 minutes. I have one more substantive question for you. All-time favorite footnote or catch in a filing? You can give multiple if you want, but is there something truly ridiculous that stands out from all the years of reading footnotes?
I think Chesapeake, yeah, the one that comes to mind is Chesapeake Energy back when Aubrey McClendon, I mean, I hate to speak poorly of the
Yeah.
dead, but there was a filing back in, I want to say close to 10 years ago, it might have even been longer ago, where he got the company to buy his antique map collection. And it was like something like 13 or 14 million dollars. And like, it was just sort of like, the company that he runs, that he's chairman and CEO of, is buying a map collection from him, an antique map collection. And the person appraising, and then they said something like, and we know it's worth this much because the person appraising it bought the map collection for him as his consultant. I mean, it was so like riddled with like, another one was a company that had like they called it a fish shack, like it was a, what company was it? Schulman.
Yeah.
And they had like this, like what they called a fish shack up in, somewhere in Canada. And it was like, then, they used it for entertaining. And okay, companies need to entertain. But then when that CEO left, they sold it to the CEO for some kind of bargain basement. And when they disclosed it, it wasn't quite a shack, unless you call like something like a 5,000 square foot house a shack. But
Yeah.
most people would not call a 5,000 square foot house on a
Yeah.
lake shack,
Yeah.
and so there's just all sorts of like crazy things like that. I mean, another one of my favorites, I think it was like was it Frontier Airlines? Oh, no, Quest Communications, I'm sorry, Quest, I think,
Yeah.
where the CEO's daughter was like, they had hired a new CEO,
Yeah.
and the CEO's daughter was in high school and she wanted to stay behind in San Francisco. Fair enough. I have kids. I know what it's like to move with kids. But in order to get her to Denver, where the guy was based, they had a corporate jet pick her up. And I'm thinking, like, San Francisco to Denver, there's a lot of planes that it's not like, like
Yeah.
two odd cities. Like, she could have gotten on a regular flight, even if the company decided they were going to pay for it. But, like, to have a corporate jet, when you're access to a corporate jet that the publicly traded company, is paying for, that's just like, again, disgusting. I mean, you ought to be embarrassed by that.
Fair enough, Michelle. This has been awesome. Any final words, closing thoughts, things we missed you wanted to talk about?
I'm really glad that my son is back in school. My son is 11 years old, and it was a tough year and a half to try to read SEC filings and get him onto Zoom calls on time. So hopefully you'll be seeing a bit more of me and a lot of other parents who have kind of ducked out of life or their business lives for a while. So, yeah.
Well, Michelle, thanks again for your time. Everyone should follow you at Footnoted on Twitter or go to your blog, footnoted.com. Both are awesome. And I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks, Edwin.